A billionaire disguised himself as a homeless man and walked into his own luxury restaurant in Chicago, ordering the most expensive steak on the menu, just to see how his staff truly treated the powerless. He was mocked, humiliated, and quietly set up for something dangerous. When the steak was placed before him, a waitress named Grace silently slipped a tiny piece of paper into his hand. He read it, and his blood ran cold. Not from fear, but because someone had just revealed a truth that would bring everything crashing down. That note stopped him from taking a single bite and prepared him to expose a corruption so deep it shook everyone in that room. But what did it say? Welcome to Radiant Story and Tales. While you are here, I want you to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share to your loved ones. This will help us bring more interesting stories. You know, sometimes the richest people in the world need to see what it's really like at the bottom. That's exactly what James Parker decided to do one cold Saturday night in Chicago. James was worth more money than most of us could count. He owned 15 fancy restaurants across America, each one serving steaks that cost more than some people's weekly paycheck. But James wasn't born rich. No, sir. 40 years ago, he was sleeping on park benches, digging through trash cans just to find something to eat. He kept an old jacket in the back of his closet. It was torn at the elbows, stained with years of hard living. He hadn't worn it in decades. But tonight, he pulled it on over his shoulders and looked at himself in the mirror. His assistant, Rebecca, watched him with worried eyes. "Mr. Parker, please, send someone else to check on the restaurant. This is dangerous." James shook his head. "Nobody else can see what I need to see, Rebecca." See, James had received a letter the week before. No return address, just a video clip, and 3 sentences typed on plain paper. The video showed security guards dragging a homeless man out of one of his restaurants while rich customers laughed and pointed. The letter said, "The Sterling, you're a restaurant, your responsibility." The Sterling was James's restaurant in downtown Chicago. The numbers looked bad. Sales were down. But James didn't care about the numbers right now. He cared about something else. Something that made his chest tight with old anger. 40 years ago, when James was hungry and desperate, a restaurant cook had caught him looking through the garbage. That cook poured boiling water on James's hands just for being poor. The scar was still there on his right hand, faded but permanent. A reminder of the cruelty people show when they think you don't matter. James built his restaurants on one simple rule. Treat every person with respect, no matter what they look like. If that rule was being broken in his own place, he needed to know, so he rubbed dirt on his face. He took off his expensive watch. He slipped a small phone into a hidden part of his shoe, and he walked out into the night, looking like a man who had nothing. The Sterling restaurant glowed like a jewel in the Chicago darkness. Crystal lights hung from the ceiling. White tablecloths covered every table. Men in expensive suits sat next to women wearing diamonds. The smell of grilled steak and red wine filled the air. And then James walked in. You should have seen their faces. The hostess looked at him like he was dirt on her clean floor. The security guard moved toward him, hand already reaching for his radio. And then the manager appeared. His name was Derek Morrison. He was the kind of man who smiled at rich people and sneered at poor ones. He had worked at the Sterling for 6 years, and he ran that place like it was his kingdom. "Sir," Derek said, his voice dripping fake politeness, "I think you've made a mistake. This place might not be right for you." James didn't move. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick roll of cash. More money than most people carried. "Table for one," he said calmly. "I'll have the Wagyu steak. Medium rare. I'll pay now." The room went quiet. Derek's smile froze on his face. He couldn't refuse. The customer was paying. But every part of him wanted to throw this dirty homeless man back onto the street. "Of course," Derek said through clenched teeth. "Right this way." He led James to the worst table in the whole restaurant, back in the corner, near the kitchen doors and the bathroom, where the noise was loudest and sometimes you could smell the garbage from outside. It was a table they used to make people uncomfortable enough to leave. James sat down without complaining. Derek looked around the dining room. His eyes landed on a waitress named Grace Thompson. Grace was 32 years old. She had worked at the Sterling for 4 years. She had a 9-year-old daughter at home with asthma and medical bills that never seemed to stop growing. "You," Derek said to Grace, "you're always talking about helping people. Here's your chance." It was meant as punishment. Grace knew it. Derek knew it. Everyone knew it. Grace walked to the table with a pitcher of water. She poured a glass without looking at the man's face. But when she set it down, something made her look up. His eyes caught hers. And in that moment, Grace felt something she couldn't quite name. This man wasn't what he seemed. His posture was too straight. His gaze was too steady. These weren't the eyes of someone who had given up on life. These were the eyes of someone who was watching, waiting, testing. Grace felt a chill run down her spine. In the kitchen, Derek pulled the head cook aside. His name was Tony Rodriguez. Tony was 30 years old, talented, and trapped. His wife was 8 months pregnant, and they had bills stacking up at home that kept him awake at night. Derek led Tony to a corner where the security cameras couldn't see. "The steak for the homeless guy," Derek said quietly. "Use the one that came back yesterday. The one that sat out for 2 hours." Tony felt his stomach drop. "Derek, that meat is bad. If he eats it, he gets a stomach ache." "So what?" Derek laughed softly. "Who's going to believe a homeless man over a 5-star restaurant?" Tony stood there, frozen. He thought about his pregnant wife. He thought about the bills. He thought about the $1,500 bottle of wine he'd dropped last month that Derek said he'd take care of so it wouldn't come out of Tony's paycheck. "Just do what I tell you," Derek said. "Unless you want to explain to your wife why you're unemployed." Tony nodded slowly. He felt sick inside, but he nodded. Neither of them saw Grace standing behind a rack of dishes, close enough to hear every word. Grace's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her chest. She pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing. The words she just heard kept echoing in her head. "Use the one that sat out for 2 hours." That meant bacteria. That meant food poisoning. That meant someone could end up in the hospital. Or worse. Derek walked past her, heading back to the dining room. Tony turned and almost ran into her. Their eyes met. Tony saw that she'd heard everything. His face went pale. He shook his head slowly. A warning. Don't say anything. Don't do anything. Forget what you heard. Then he walked away, leaving Grace alone with an impossible choice. If she stayed quiet, she'd keep her job. She'd pay for her daughter Katie's asthma medicine. She'd keep the roof over their heads. She'd survive. If she spoke up, nobody would believe her. Derek would fire her on the spot. She'd lose everything she'd spent years building. Her daughter would suffer because of her choice. But if she did nothing, that man was going to eat poisoned food. And whatever happened to him would be on her conscience forever. Grace walked back to the dining room on shaking legs. She glanced toward the corner table. The homeless man sat quietly, looking at the menu like he had all the time in the world. Then Grace looked up. Security cameras. There were 8 of them covering every angle of the restaurant. Derek watched those cameras every single night. Last month, he'd fired a busboy for taking a 6-minute break instead of 5. If she warned the man out loud, Derek would know. She'd be fired before sunrise. But if she stayed silent, that man could die. Grace's mother's voice came to her then, a memory from years ago. Her mother on her deathbed, holding Grace's hand. "Baby girl, someday you'll have to choose between doing what's right and keeping what's safe. But if you don't do what's right, you'll lose yourself. And that's worse than losing anything else." Grace had been 23 then, pregnant with Katie, abandoned by Katie's father. She thought she understood what her mother meant. Now, standing in this restaurant with her whole life hanging in the balance, she finally did. The staff bathroom was the only room without cameras. Derek had complained about it, but the owner refused, saying it violated privacy laws. Grace slipped away from the dining room and locked herself in the bathroom. Her hands were shaking as she tore a piece of paper from her order pad, small enough to hide in her palm. She wrote quickly, "Don't eat it. The meat is bad. They did it on purpose. They want to hurt you." She folded the paper until it was tiny. It felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Now came the hard part. When Grace walked back through the kitchen, Tony was putting the steak on a white plate. It looked perfect, beautiful, golden brown and glistening. Nobody looking at it would ever know it was poison. Grace stopped beside Tony. "You know this is wrong," she whispered. Tony didn't look at her. "I don't know what you're talking about. That meat sat out for 2 hours. You know what that means." "Stop." Tony finally looked at her, and Grace could see the fear in his eyes. "I have a baby coming in 6 weeks. My wife can't work. If I lose this job..." His voice broke. Grace wanted to argue, but looking at him, she understood. He wasn't evil. He was trapped, just like her. Just like everyone who worked in places like this, where the people at the top held all the power and the people at the bottom held all the risk. "Fine," Grace said softly. "You didn't see anything." Relief washed over Tony's face, followed immediately by shame. But Grace had already turned away. She picked up the plate. The steak was still hot, steam rising from it. To anyone watching, she was just doing her job. She walked through the dining room, weaving between tables. 10 feet away, 5 feet, 2 feet. She stopped at the corner table and set the plate down gently. "Your steak, sir," she said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Medium rare, just like you ordered." The man looked up at her. Again, those intelligent eyes studied her face. Grace placed the silverware beside the plate. As she did, her hand brushed against his. In that brief touch, she pressed a folded paper into his palm. She felt his fingers close around it. "Enjoy your meal," she said, holding his gaze for just 1 second longer than necessary. Then she turned and walked away, her heart hammering in her chest so loud she was sure the whole restaurant could hear it. James felt the paper in his hand. He waited until Grace was across the room, then quietly unfolded it below the table. "Don't eat it. The meat is bad. They did it on purpose. They want to hurt you." He read it 3 times. Then he looked at the beautiful steak sitting in front of him. Something cold settled in his chest. It was anger, but it was something else too. Something he hadn't felt in 40 years. He remembered being 22. Hungry, desperate, digging through garbage. He remembered the cook who caught him, the boiling water, the scar that still marked his hand, the laughter. He had built his restaurant empire to prove that poor people deserve dignity. And now, in one of his own restaurants, they would try to poison someone for being homeless. James set down his knife and fork. He wouldn't eat. He wouldn't leave. He would sit here and watch. And when the time was right, he would make sure everyone knew the truth. 20 minutes passed. The steak sat there, growing cold. James just sipped his water, watching the room. Behind the bar, Derek was getting nervous. The homeless man should have eaten by now. Instead, he just sat there, calm, still, like he was waiting for something. Something was very wrong. Derek smoothed his tie and walked over to the corner table, forcing his customer service smile into place. "Is everything okay with your meal, sir?" Derek asked. "You haven't touched it." The homeless man looked up. There was something in his expression that made Derek uncomfortable, like he was the one being judged. "I'm enjoying the atmosphere," the man said calmly. Derek's smile flickered. "If something's wrong with the food, I can have the kitchen make you something else." "The food looks perfect," the man said, his eyes never leaving Derek's face. "I'm just taking my time." Something was wrong. Derek could feel it crawling up his spine like a warning. This man wasn't acting like a homeless person should act. He was too calm, too controlled, too confident. Derek glanced across the room at Grace. She had served him. She had been alone with him. Had she said something? He would deal with her later. 30 minutes later, a wealthy woman at a nearby table waved Derek over. She was dripping in diamonds and designer clothes. "This is unacceptable," she hissed. "We're paying $400 for dinner, and we have to sit near that." She pointed at James with pure disgust. "The smell alone is ruining my meal." Derek nodded. "I'll handle it right away, ma'am." He walked back to table 7 with purpose. "Sir, I need to ask you to leave. We need this table for other guests." James looked up calmly. "I paid for my meal. I'll stay. I'll refund your money." I don't want a refund. I want to sit here. Derek felt his patience snap. Sir, I must insist. On what grounds? James's voice was quiet but clear. I paid for my food. I'm not bothering anyone. What law am I breaking? Derek opened his mouth and closed it. The man was right. He couldn't forcibly remove a paying customer without cause. Not with all these witnesses. Not with cell phones everywhere. He needed another approach. His eyes found Grace again. If he couldn't blame the customer, he'd blame the staff. Derek raised his voice. Grace Thompson, come here, please. Grace set down her water pitcher and walked over, her face carefully blank. I've received complaints, Derek announced loudly, that you were inappropriate with this guest, that you made offensive comments. I have no choice but to suspend you immediately. Grace's eyes went wide. That's not true. I didn't say anything. Multiple witnesses say otherwise, Derek continued, talking over her. Please collect your things and leave. The dining room went silent. Every eye was on them. Grace stood there, unable to speak. She thought about Katie at home. The medical bills, her brother's college tuition, everything crumbling around her. She had done the right thing, and now she was being punished for it. I didn't do anything wrong, she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. The witnesses say otherwise. Please leave. Grace looked around the room. The other servers looked away. The customers watched like this was entertainment. No one moved. No one spoke. She was alone. And then, from the corner table, a voice cut through the silence. She didn't say anything inappropriate. Everyone turned. The homeless man was standing now. She brought me my food, he continued calmly. She was polite and professional. That's all. Derek's face hardened. Sir, this is an internal matter. No, the man said quietly. This is a public accusation, made in front of dozens of witnesses. If you're going to fire this woman, at least be honest about why. Something in his tone made Derek step back. The homeless man's whole posture had changed. He stood straighter. His presence filled the room. He no longer looked like someone society had thrown away. He looked like someone who was used to being in charge. Who are you? Derek demanded. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I think it's time everyone found out. James reached down and removed a shoe. The nearby customers pulled back in disgust. But instead of what they expected, James pulled a small phone from a hidden compartment. He pressed a button. 30 seconds later, the restaurant doors opened. A woman in a sharp business suit walked in, heels clicking on the floor. Behind her came 2 lawyers and 4 security personnel. They had been waiting across the street the whole time, listening through an open line. The woman crossed the room and stopped beside James. She turned to address the crowd, her voice commanding. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce James Parker, founder and owner of the entire Sterling restaurant chain. Gasps rippled through the room. The wealthy woman who complained turned pale. Her husband stared in horror. Derek stood frozen, the color draining from his face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. James stepped forward. Even in his torn clothes, even with dirt on his face, he carried himself with undeniable authority. I've been recording everything tonight, he said, holding up the phone. Every word, including the conversation in your kitchen about serving me contaminated meat. Derek shook his head frantically. That's a lie. I never. Really? James gestured at the untouched plate. Then explain what's wrong with this steak. The one you ordered your cook to prepare using meat that sat at room temperature for 2 hours. The crowd erupted in disgust. Several diners pushed their plates away. James turned toward the kitchen. Tony Rodriguez, you have a choice. Tell the truth about what happened tonight, or I'll play the recording and let everyone hear your voice agreeing to poison a customer. Tony appeared in the doorway, his face white as snow. He looked at Derek, then at Grace, standing alone, destroyed for doing the right thing while he'd stayed silent in fear. Tony stepped forward. His voice cracked. Derek ordered me to use the bad steak. It sat out for almost 2 hours. He said nobody would believe a homeless man if he got sick. The restaurant exploded. People shouted. Phones came out. The security team blocked the exits. Derek tried to run. The security team caught him in seconds. 40 years ago, James sat quietly, walking toward Derek. Someone poured boiling water on my hands because I was hungry and poor. He laughed while I screamed. He told me I was worthless. James held up his scarred hand. I built this company so no one would ever be treated that way again, and you turned it into exactly what I swore to destroy. The police arrived minutes later. Derek was arrested. The restaurant was closed. An hour later, only James and Grace remained. Grace sat by the window, exhausted and uncertain. She'd done the right thing and lost everything anyway. James sat across from her. When you wrote that note, you knew it could cost you everything. Why did you do it? Grace looked up at him. Because 40 years ago, nobody helped you, and you've been carrying that pain ever since. I couldn't do that to another person. James was quiet for a long moment. I need someone to run this restaurant when it reopens. Someone who understands what it should be. Someone with courage. Grace stared at him. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a choice. This isn't charity. It's an opportunity. 1 week later, Grace accepted. 3 months later, the Sterling reopened. Grace stood at the entrance as the new general manager, greeting every guest with warmth and dignity. The door opened. A homeless man walked in, nervous and uncertain. Grace stepped forward immediately. Welcome to the Sterling, she said with a genuine smile. Would you like a table by the window? The man stared at her in disbelief, waiting for the trick, but there was none. We have a community menu for anyone who needs it, Grace said gently. Please, come in. On the wall near the entrance hung a small frame. Inside was the note Grace had written that night. Below it, a plaque read, "One act of courage can change everything." This note saved a life and exposed corruption. It reminds us that dignity is not a privilege. It is a right. Grace Thompson, general manager, and every new employee learned the story. The story of the night, a billionaire dressed as a homeless man to test his own restaurant, and the waitress with nothing to lose who risked everything to save him. Because sometimes the people with the least power are the ones who change the world.